Hi pals, it's me, Artie, they them pronouns only. After a hectic month, it feels, with all of the travelling I've been doing recently, I finally bring to you Skins Generation 1 Disability Analysis. I made a lot of notes. To be fair, as I was watching the first generation, I was also making notes on queerness in Skins, in case that's also something anyone would be interested in me making a video on. I at least have the notes. So let me know if that's something that you would like to see. So, without further delay, I have sort of three main sections. I'm just gonna do my best, you know? Partway through watching this generation, I was kind of just feeling like this whole group is a very neurodivergent group of friends. Teenagers struggling to navigate social situations and expectations. I have a little bit of a summary of each person. Our star of the show, sort of, is Chris. He pretty much has a family history of a bunch of stuff. The main ones we know about are his mum has bipolar and his brother died of some mystery hereditary chronic illness. I also headcanon Chris as an ADHDer. He definitely needs a lot of stimulation in life, really struggles to commit to like anything, especially if it's boring. He was a very easy target for adult predators and was really heartbroken when that didn't go well. He was very obviously taken advantage of by Angie. She pretty much has him in this secret relationship. He's not very good at boundaries because nobody's really taught him boundaries. We're just gonna go with Sid next. Again, like, family history. His dad just dies one day. I don't remember if they specified how. My assumption is that he died of just like a heart attack or a stroke or something. Sid is also very neurodivergent, ADHD, dyslexic, terrible at coursework. He's often described in really ADHD terms, pretty much. His room is a mess, like actually disgusting. Literally in episode 1, the way Tony gets Sid out of bed is by calling Sid's dad and telling him that Sid is late for a sociology exam. Sid doesn't even realise it's not true until he gets to college and says, I didn't have a sociology test, did I? He's always extremely unlucky, extremely clumsy, often steered into social situations that he, you know, not by his choice necessarily, but definitely manipulated and convinced into doing or being involved in these situations. A lot of the time don't or didn't have anything to do with him until somebody convinced him to participate. I think the first episode that's Sid only as well, the storyline is basically about him being so behind on his coursework that he's going to fail, and his dad uses ADHD descriptors like hard to focus, and this comes up a lot in this generation, like repeatedly. There's a lot of weird things we see Sid like seeing that nobody else is seeing. I think it's the janitor and maybe the dinner lady or something of the college having like a romantic affair. I just wonder if that was like maladaptive daydreaming, because it's never really explained whether it was actually happening or not, but I think it is Sid having maladaptive daydreams because he's just not dealing with anything when he's sort of first introduced in the show. He never has any clean clothes. The main thing you see a lot of the time is that Sid is always being taken advantage of, mainly by Tony, and he's always a disappointment to his dad. He has a hyperfixation on Michelle, which then redirects onto Cassie, and he's really terrible at expressing his thoughts and feelings, which gets him into a lot of trouble. Cassie, obviously eating disorder, mental health stuff, but I also think that she's probably autistic. I think that maybe in season 2 she could have some kind of like personality disorder like BPD or other kinds of like trauma related mental health issues, because yeah, she's not nice in season 2, and that is all directly stemming from certain situations that happened between her instead. Whilst she was my favourite character when this show was coming out, I don't really like her anymore for quite a few reasons. And my preference is leaning towards Chris and Maxie, to be honest. Growth. As a side note, a lot of eating disorders do or can lead to physical disability and other like physical health problems. We have Sketch, who is a child carer to her parent. I will go into more detail about that a bit later. Jal, I think, is autistic. Oh, also, like, I have a preference for Jal as well. I think she was actually highly underrated. She's quite harsh. She can quite easily be read and portrayed as the stereotype of the angry black woman, but I just see her as autistic and a black woman. She's very direct and logical in her communications with people and in her thought process. She gets frustrated by illogical issues. It seems like her whole family has like a special interest in music, and she is a brilliant clarinet player. Episode 3 is like her introduction to the show and more detail about her background and her family. I also really headcanon her as a PDA autistic, like very pathological demand avoidance vibes, and it makes me laugh quite a lot. There's particular moments of that. She doesn't like the way that she was being treated. She was being tokenized quite a lot as like, the thing was, is like, she's obviously the only like black person in this competition, and by that they were making the assumption that she must be poor, council estate, on benefits, that sort of thing, which in that episode you do actually see it, that is completely incorrect. And she does come from a quite well off family in the music industry. So in one interview, all of her answers to their questions was just no. It's just very funny. I really enjoyed rewatching that, particularly looking at it through the lens of Jal being autistic as well. She takes things very literally, logically minded, responsible, and then struggles to relate to the others on like a superficial level. Michelle is one I don't have a whole lot of thoughts on when it comes to neurodivergence, but I do see and recognise some neurodivergent traits. She is easily manipulated by Tony as well. She has no idea what she wants. I think a lot of the issue with Michelle's character is the writing. They don't really include a lot about her in the same way that they did about other characters. We got to know her mum and her mum's sort of like history with impulsive decisions with relationships and constantly being married and divorced and remarried and divorced. The weird way that her mum seems to love and adore Michelle, but also always seems to put these men before her. Like, we don't really get to know much about what she wants or is studying or anything like that for the future until like right near the end of season 2 through Anwar. So a lot about her is pretty much kind of just used as a pawn in this show, which to me does read kind of neurodivergent. She has very big feelings. She's easily like falls in love with people, and she feels like all that she has to give is her body and sex, and she has that hyperfixation on Tony in particular. Maxie calls out hypocrisy and contradictions, particularly obviously around queerness, homophobia, stuff like that. He's honest to a fault sometimes. Special interest is dance. Again, big feelings and means what he says. Anwar takes certain things too literally, especially when it comes to his religion. It seems that it only is brought into question when he has this conflict with Maxie later on, which is something that I would go into more in the queer video if you want to see that. But also in family situations, he can't always tell really when people are joking. Cannot talk to girls. He really has like a high-key, awkward British boy energy, and just generally does not recognise subtext in what people say. And finally, Tony is hit by a bus at the end of season 1. His mum and his sister become his carers, and then that leaves his mum going a little bit mad. But also, besides the disability post-accident, I feel like he is definitely also neurodivergent. When I talk about this, I don't mean this in any kind of like criticism or taboo kind of way, but from his behaviours and the way he interacts with people, he does read as possibly having narcissistic personality disorder. Now, I'm basing this off of the Mayo Clinic's site, which had narcissistic personality disorder separate from antisocial personality disorder. They're quite different things from that website, but I think generally on the internet they get conflated. The Mayo website says narcissistic personality disorder includes things like has beliefs about being special and more important than others, has fantasies about power, success, and being attractive to others, does not understand the needs and feelings of others, stretches the truth about achievements or talents, expects constant praise and wants to be admired, feels superior to others and brags about it, expects favours and advantages without a good reason, often takes advantage of others, and is jealous of others or believes that others are jealous of them. Yeah, I'm not saying this in any kind of intention of with any kind of intention of malice. It's just that as I was doing this rewatch in particular, I felt like a lot of Tony's behaviours and interactions that you are shown match up quite well with that as a diagnosis. And I think Skins does a reasonably good job of showing him as complicated and multi-layered, and that it's not as simple as what a lot of other media portrays narcissistic personality disorder as. But also, of course, I do not have that diagnosis. I have maybe met a handful of people in my life who have, so again, there's not going to be a huge amount of commentary from me on that, but I think it was something that's worth mentioning when it comes to seeing the neurodivergence of these different characters in this one generation of Skins. Kind of getting into a more episode by episode vibe here. A lot of the points I'll be talking about are so interconnected with other characters that it would be kind of next to impossible / very, very difficult to try and separate it by character when they are so connected in this way. So it's a little bit easier to kind of go chronologically from here. Jal has a very intense sense of justice. She gets very angry when Sid stands Cassie up and mucks her around, which leads to Cassie's unalive attempt, where Jal is in the ambulance with her, taking her to the hospital. And I have like a side note just saying that this hospital ward is really fucking empty. Sid goes home and finds out his mum left his dad. Sid gets angry and then parrots a lot of those like really awful things that his dad says to him to his dad about how like useless and stupid he is and how he should do this, that and the other, which just like sounds really silly in the context of your wife's just left you. And I think that's the point, is like it's not as easy as just do whatever. Then they all go on like a Russian trip. This is when Chris and Angie like first get together physically. I don't have any like specific quotes from this section, so I don't remember what exactly she was saying, Angie, but she starts shouting at Chris like them getting together was his fault. He's 17, if that. This season doesn't do a very good job of showing that this is illegal and bad. And then again, Sydney gets into all sorts of fucking trouble on this trip, this time thanks to Anwar. And my one note is like,
what have we learned, Sydney? Your friends are shitheads and you need better boundaries.
I just stop agreeing to do this stuff. Don't do it. Then there's some moments Tony tries to get with Maxie whilst they are in Russia, and whilst Tony's still with Michelle, and Michelle was also in the room. So there's a big load of fallout from that, pretty much. Maxie tries to talk to Michelle. No. But this is Michelle's episode. Maxie admits to the whole class what happened, and everyone's like... And my note here is about Tony. He literally just does everything because he can. Michelle tries to hook up with Sid for reasons unknown. but just ends up crying whilst they are both like partially undressed, and Sid's dad sees them. And then I've just made a note here of like the iconic mental illness home that I visited said mental illness home when I was in Bristol, but this is technically not in Bristol, it's like more Somerset-y area, so I could live my mental illness Cassie Tumblr dreams. I feel like Effie probably has some traits of narcissistic personality disorder as well, but I feel like maybe a more complex version, including some PTSD in there, particularly in her own generation, which I can approach in another video some other time maybe. But my notes here are from the odd episode she had in Generation 1, where she often uses neurodivergent people to get what she wants. Her episode in season 1 is her with her like daft friend before Pandora, and an adult man who thinks she's so cool, and he invited her to this warehouse party. She always abandons these neurodivergent friends when it's convenient for her. It feels like it was learned from her brother. Sid finally calls Tony out on his shit, and Tony is just always derailing whenever someone's actually calling him out on being a shithead. He never really responds to what people actually say. It's always sort of a deflection. And they were in A&E in the middle of the night because of the whole Effie thing. And because of Tony's own actions, somebody who does not like Tony targeted Effie and gave her heroin. Again, A&E, very empty for the middle of the night in the UK. And then yeah, I just made another note here of like Sid is just always injuring himself. Like he manages to burn himself on lighters semi-regularly, and in this particular scene he burnt himself on like whilst making a hot drink. And then leading into the final episode of the first season, Effie's being sent off to private school. It's Anwar's birthday. Sid goes to the madhouse because he wants to try and win over Cassie, because he's done a lot of really stupid shit and said really bad things basically the whole time he's known her, and he's now just decided he likes her. Like,
Oh, you're moving to Scotland? Well, I'm in love with you, actually.
but he goes there to find her because he literally words things so badly. The staff think he is insane and needs to be locked up. He turns up with 2 different pairs of shoes on. The famous cartoon dog it was, but if you press it, it goes da da da, puppy power, and like rambling in a way that it's just like you are not actually explaining anything of what you mean, and you just sound like you're talking about invisible people that don't exist. So he gets locked up. Tony has to come and get him later. Michelle goes and visits Effie to check in on her at her new school that also runs on a Saturday. What? Michelle is asking her why she doesn't speak, because that's the whole thing. She doesn't really speak in most of the time she's in these shows, to be honest. And then she just starts talking about Tony again, so... Cassie then shows up to Anwar's party, and Tony is there. So Tony and Cassie have a chat, and he gives her the letter from Sid that he wrote but left on the side. Merv, who I haven't mentioned before because that's more of a queer video one really, is Angie's ex-fiance. He turns up to Anwar's birthday with like a bunch of his adult man friends to literally fight children because Chris stole Angie's engagement ring. That's when Merv and his mates start fighting these children, all of these 17-year-olds. Tony was still out in his car because he's got his sister with him, so he is talking to Michelle on the phone. She's in the party, but she's in the bathroom crying. The signal's not good, so Tony walks out into the road trying to get better signal as he is trying to genuinely apologise. It seems like he has realised the things he does are actually not great and actually don't really benefit him either. So we see that he might be about to have like a whole character growth arc, and he gets hit by a bus. And then there's this really, really camp singing sequence where all of the cast are singing this song, and I forgot this, but they literally had Tony looking dead, with its head in Effie's lap, also mouthing the words to the song whilst Effie cries over him. Very camp, but like extremely disturbing as well. It's swiftly moving into season 2. We open up the new season with a Maxi special. He has a dance sequence. We don't really get a lot of Maxi in season 1 except from specifically about the homophobia with Anwar. And even this season you don't really see much of him after his stalker problems. After the dance we see that Tony was there as well, and like I just have to say, whoever did the hair makeup costume for disabled Tony needs to be sued. Why was his hair like that? Like, something happened to his hair after he got hit by a bus, and then as soon as he magically recovers later on, his hair's back to like pre-disabled hair. And I like, why? Okay, so I'm gonna put that down just to the hair department, because I actually think the costume department did quite a good job. They had to find different ways of showing his disability in his clothing by having accessible options of clothing for him. He had accessible belt buckle, he had Velcro shoes now. You know, he clearly has brain damage, and he's also got PTSD around any large vehicles driving past him, which so valid. Like I said, his mum and sister are like main at-home carers, but also a lot of his friends take on different kinds of caring responsibilities too, kind of just like being like an extra safety precaution when he's out in public. So like they'll walk him home and pick him up from his house. He's never left on his own to navigate public transport or just being outside on his own, which I think was a nice touch and quite a nice way of showing how friends and community are important in disabled people being able to access the world outside of their home. And he has a lot of memory issues, so I don't think he'd be able to just hop on a bus. He doesn't seem to remember a lot, particularly anything interpersonal. We kind of get to see that Maxi and his family are working class. A lot of the people we see in this show are definitely not working class. Like, Sid's family have got a really nice family home, Tony's family are definitely well off, Jal's family are well off, Chris is definitely working class and becomes homeless, Anwar, great family home as well. I'm trying to think, have I missed anyone? Michelle's mum has a great job, but also she marries rich men a lot of the time who end up with really fancy, ridiculous houses. There's not a lot of working class like representation, weirdly, because they do also then have like the super posh antagonists in this show as well. But that's also where they end up sending Effie and where Effie meets Pandora. So there's not that much separation. Yeah, I just find it really funny because it's like, it's not like you guys aren't also like middle class posh well off, just a different brand, I guess. Maxi's mum used to be Tony's family's like cleaner, but yeah, his family live in a flat in the like local estate, which is where Sketch also lives with her mum. And Maxi's dad is a builder. Tony's mum, we start to see that she's struggling with her mental health, trying to deal with everything that's happened to her son. And we see a lot of adaptive technology in mostly the bathroom. So like bath chair, bidet, like one of those frames around the toilets, and also a red like alarm cord. And there's kind of like a funny sequence where Anthea, who is Tony's mum, pulls the alarm cord instead of the light switch, as she's sort of just like staring depressively at everything else, and it's like funny in like a sad way. Maxi obviously lives in this estate where there's a lot of homophobic working class people, so Max and his dad have like a whole argument about Max's future, and whilst that's going on, Tony is also there and needs help to go to the toilet and is calling out for Sid, but obviously he's not at Sid's house. Sid is not there. Maxi's mum does come to help him and he says, I need to pee, my hands don't work. So like even with the accessible adapted belts, he still can't unlatch it to then go to the toilet, and they just sort of laugh it off. Chris and Jal then come to like pick him up and take him home, and Tony still thinks Sid is doing it. I don't know how long for, it's not really clear, but for a while obviously Sid hasn't actually been around, and neither has Michelle. They both seem to have been there whilst he was in the hospital, and they weren't really sure if he was maybe going to make it. But as soon as he, you know, pretty much was dubbed no longer at risk of dying, it seems like that both of them kind of just evaporated. Everyone else is going to a party that Tony doesn't know about until Anwar slips up by not reading the social cues of Jal and Chris. He wants to go, obviously, but no one wants to take him. We have this random clip of Sid looking at photos of Tony in the hospital, which are not necessarily graphic, but definitely like a bit scary and haunting. Lots of bandages and hospital equipment, things like that. And he now has a huge photo of Cassie on his wall. Tony is a slower walker now, and he's much slower to like get jokes that people are telling. I feel like a lot of this is kind of Tony learning how other people felt about how he treated them, which like I'm not a huge fan because it definitely falls into the disability as a punishment trope, which is not my vibe. Don't enjoy that. Tony gets Effie, his younger sister, to take him to this party. Tony also is shown that he can't really text properly, featuring old phones, which aren't really fun to text on anyway, but like probably especially harder when you're learning how, like relearning how to use your fine motor skills, because he's relearning how to write as well at this point. And then they bump into one of those posh bitches, Abigail, I think her name is. Okay, so here's a warning for like some like pretty gnarly ableist language. She says to somebody about him having been a total mong. She would have been so sad if they'd had to turn you off like a vegetable, yeah? Yeah, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of the R slur as well in this show. Everyone was mocking Jal by being a prude as well at this party, because she's often called a killjoy and like a prude, and it's like, maybe you all just genuinely are very stupid. Lighthearted, but like everybody is so prone to making some of the absolute worst decisions with next to no logic in them, that anyone with any kind of like logical thinking is boring. Tony immediately just like cannot deal with this rave. He cannot take the lights, the sound, the amount of people. Maxie tries to help him, but just they end up outside on their own and separated. Tony overhears Sid and Michelle talking shit about Tony and all of the stuff that like went on before the accident, but also with the accident. Tony can't remember how to get home either, so he ends up just sat on Maxie's doorstep when Maxie finds him in the morning. Maxie helps Tony learn how to write by describing using a pen, like imagine the pen's dancing across the page. And it kind of works. It helps Tony sort of exit his critical voice, which is a really big step for him in his recovery. We then also have an episode about Sketch. I also have some like trans related thoughts about Sketch generally, which kind of makes her plotline worse, to be honest. She's getting ready for school. We see her binding her chest. Her mum talks to her through like a monitor, like a little... She helps her mum go to the toilet. She's been lying to her mum about Maxie being her boyfriend. And her mum says, bet you don't want to introduce him to the scary disabled mother. I tried to find out more about the actress who played her mum, and I really couldn't find a lot. There's not really a lot of information available about her generally out there, so I was not able to work out if she's disabled as well, but her character has MS. So there's like a bunch of stuff that happens, but basically she sneaks into Maxie's flat. Considering I literally live in the middle of nowhere, it is so fucking loud here. Oh my fucking god. Into his room, stays there overnight, and then has to sneak out again in the morning to go back home. When she does go back home, she's gone back to her mum, who has fallen and wet herself on the floor, and she's probably been there all night. She thought Sketch had gone to bed, so she was going to check if she'd gone to bed or not, because I think she needed medication or needed to go to the toilet or something like that. So that's when she fell. So it was sometime from like 8 p.m. the previous day, and she was just there all night. Her mum is never horrible to her, only when some of the fucked up shit comes out. But she tries to lighten the mood. Sketch is actually being quite nasty, and yeah, being a carer is hard, but she does get progressively worse in how she treats her mum. There's definitely carer on disabled person abuse. Sketch had dropped one of her hair clips in Maxie's room, and he found it and recognised it, I think the next day or so at college, when Michelle invited Sketch to come hang out with them at lunch. So he then goes to Sketch's flat. He somehow knows exactly where she lives. I don't, like, how do you know this? But he goes to the front door and rings like the intercom, starts having a go, and it's answered by her disabled mother, who is very distressed and confused about who this person is that's shouting down the intercom. And she's also fallen out of her seat when answering, so she's laying on the floor as well whilst dealing with all of that. She catches that it's Maxie, so she starts telling him all the things that Sketch has been telling her, and he's like, what the fuck? So now both of them know the truth about Sketch, what she's been doing and saying. Her mum does call her out and realises something else that she'd said was also a lie, and she says, I didn't bring you up to be a liar. And the retort Sketch has is, you didn't bring me up at all, you fucking cripple. And there's just dead silence for a while as Sketch has her mum pinned down at the wrists onto her bed. She then straps her mum's wrists to, there isn't really a bed frame, but there's sort of like a partial frame that's been put on there for like access needs to be able to pull yourself up and things like that safely. So she has tied her mum's wrist to that. Also, a side note, the play that they are doing in this episode is about 9/11, and it's a musical. My god. And like, I just have a note here where I was just like, imagine if instead of this plot they made Sketch trans or non-binary, because like I said, there's definitely some gender weird going on with that character, but also made her a good child carer, because like, you know, it's not very often that you see media with child carers, and the one popular media that came out back then as well is about a horrific child carer who's incredibly manipulative and abusive. Again, whilst I think that's important because the likelihood of disabled people being abused by their carers is extremely high, I do think it's a little bit shitty and unfair that the one time this is shown is when it's an underage child carer. We get some backstory in another episode about Sid's dad, Mark. Mark's dad has always been ill, is what he says. Oh my god, hello? Has always been ill, and he pretty much thinks his dad could die anytime. That means he lets his dad treat him like absolute fucking shit, as well as his son and his wife. But he does have a chat with Sid where Sid asks why his dad is always so angry, and Mark just says he's just disappointed, as fathers normally are. And Sid asks, is that how you feel about me, Dad? And Mark replies, never. And there's a really nice moment here between Sid and Mark. They've had a very strange relationship for the most part of this generation, but we really see some of those layers peeled back. Yeah, I headcanon Mark as disabled as well, like at least chronically ill, because after this he just dies. He stands up to his father for being a complete wanker. To him, about him, to his wife, about his wife, to his son, about his son, etc, etc. Throws everybody out. Everybody's gone. It's just Mark and Sid. Mark is having a little cig and a whiskey in his armchair, feeling good about himself for the first time really ever. He's stood up for himself and for people he loves against someone who has never really shown him the love that he wanted or needed or deserved. And he's talking to Sid about Cassie, and he says, if they are special, you just have to make sure that that guy is you. He is just humming to himself. Sid goes to bed, and that's where we find him dead in the morning. He died happy, hopeful about the woman he loved, because he was finally making moves as well to change the kind of dynamic and relationship that he had with his ex-wife. And he was proud of his son, proud of himself, and finally felt able to tell the truth about his feelings as well. Sid tells Tony what happened in the middle of this club. They have another like really nice moment of Tony being able to actually support Sid and care for Sid post-accident. More weird shit just happens among those two and Michelle that just really drags out. Michelle goes to talk to Tony and tries to sleep with him, and like he's currently like having problems with sexual interaction. He is unable to participate, and Michelle just gets really fucking angry at him and upset and starts crying, and it's like, why can't you get better for me? And then she hits him. I'm like, this is what I mean, the writing of her character is dreadful, because it's just like, what the fuck was that? And Tony's mum throws her out. She's like, get the fuck out. Chris gets thrown out of college and he's now homeless. His mum abandoned him a while back and he lost the house, but he was allowed to move into college halls, which are not a thing here, really. But he's obviously been thrown out of college halls because he has been thrown out of college, full stop. This is the episode where him and Jal get closer, and I feel like they are a really great couple to watch in this show. They make a pact that he can't keep saying, oh, fuck it, and she can't say no. She always has to say yes to everything that people say, every opportunity, whatever. Chris always starts things off silly and asks Jal if she'll buy him a falafel. He spends a lot of time kind of trying to find a job, and it's not working well. He is obviously like a can't work for other people, ADHD autistic vibe. Pretty much every boss he has, he just cannot get on with. Chris and Jal start falling in love because they're starting to see more of the traits that they have in themselves in each other. Chris gets to see Jal being more of like a life of the party kind of person, and she gets to see him being more responsible. And it kind of bridges that gap of like them being polar opposites, but it's like they can help each other and do help each other to develop in the areas that they are lacking in. After a party, Jal gets upset with Chris because she feels like he's not playing the game properly, and Chris kisses her and she kisses him back, and then she goes, play the game, Chris, I am.
This also feels very much like the having to follow rules, kind of autistic.
Chris managed to get a job as
An estate agent.
The guy says, sell me this cup of tea, and Chris sets his tie on fire. And like, if that doesn't say ADHD autism, I don't know what does, you know? He gets the job. He doesn't really get the competitiveness that's in some of the people in his workplace. There's an absolutely unbearable wanker. The way they sell houses is a bit weird, but like, Chris is into it. He can vibe with that. He can vibe with weird. He basically ends up becoming a squatter in a absolutely piddly little flat that he can't sell. He's tried selling it, and then he just decides to live there. He lives there with Cassie for the most part. Jal rewards him with all of his successes by sleeping with him. And like, there's just this really nice moment when that like starts happening, that he is just so entranced by her that even when she takes off her bra, he like gives her boobs a quick glance and that's it. He just like cannot stop staring into her like face, her eyes. He is just so obsessed with her in like the most adorable way, to be honest. Cassie gets really nasty from here pretty much. She is not nice to anyone she's around, and there's this really sweet moment between Chris and Jal where he's like, have you heard of the hungry caterpillar? Apparently she hasn't, which I don't believe you. But he explains that he wanted to come out of like the caterpillar like chrysalis thing, but not for him to be different, for the whole world to be different, which I thought was such a neurodivergent vibe. TBH. So basically all this other stuff happens. Chris starts getting good at selling the houses. Angie turns up wanting somewhere to rent or buy or whatever. He throws a party at his piddly flat, and Cassie basically lies to Jal and says that like Angie is back, so that means you're done with Chris. So Jal leaves, and Cassie says to Chris, Jal's gone. No, she's like gone. Angie turns up to the party for some reason. So then he sleeps with her in the bathroom but cannot like complete the action. Jal has come back as well, looking for him. So he goes after her. She notices his shirt's inside out, realises why, and then they have another falling out. And the next day, the annoying man from Chris's work comes to try and sell the flat and finds Chris there, so Chris loses his job. That's when Giles finds out she's pregnant. Angie just gives Chris her flat. What? So Chris and Cassie move into that flat instead, which is a bigger flat. Chris and Giles have a chat. He thanks her for coming and she just shows him the yes Rizzler paper. She's still playing the game, Chris. He's made like a little presentation. He basically shows her a little thing about his life growing up to kind of explain what his life has been like that not everybody knows about. Giles quite harsh. I think it's fair. He's done some shitty things to her, but they do make up and he goes to the job centre. Back to Tony again, and he wakes up from a nightmare, calls Effie, who reads to him until he falls back asleep. Effie is a good family child carer compared to Sketch, pretty much. She is always calm, kind when she speaks to both her mum and Tony. Tony goes out, but Tony notices Jal is not feeling like her normal self and is one of the only people to actually ask her about it. Cassie is dealing drugs now. Tony takes some. They talk about Sid and Michelle. It all ends with Tony saying loudly in the club when it goes quiet his dick doesn't work. The drugs then hit Tony. He's then the life of the party as if he's never been disabled, isn't dealing with brain damage, you know, any of that stuff. Is very much the same old Tony, and he treats Sid and Michelle the same way, like it's very much the same energy as season 1. But then suddenly they have a weird turn and he pukes and goes back to disabled Tony. The uni open day thing is such a weird episode. For one, there's some guy on the train with a facial difference. He's got a scar from acid or a scar from fire, like burns. But it basically turns out this man put them on himself for lols. He doesn't really have them. Like, even the character, specifically the character, does not even have these facial, like, scarring. I really hate this episode. It makes no sense. It's very overly sexual, reliant on drugs, and he's following this weird girl around who I worked out through this rewatch is Dr. Bloom from New Amsterdam that I was obsessed with. But in New Amsterdam she has a sister who is also a previous cast member from Skins, but from Generation 2 it's one of the twins. Weird girl cures him. He no longer has sex issues and is no longer disabled. Something happens and he remembers everything again. There's another Effie episode where the focus is on her mum is now mad and taking Tony's drugs, as in like his prescribed medication, and Effie is the one doing everything. She's doing the laundry, caring for mum, making food, and still having to get herself to school and all that sort of thing. This is when we meet Pandora, and more about that stuff in this video. The art teacher assigns Pandora to Effie. She doesn't want or need another person to care for. Sid is on Tony's front porch. Effie lets him in. Sid and Tony are fighting over Michelle. Pandora is just kind of there. Effie pinches the meds that were Tony's off of Anthea when she passes out to sell, and Pandora asks, is she mental? And Effie says, no, just tired. I was like, well, you can be both. There's brought up like a really long history of Sid always apologising to Tony even when Sid hasn't actually done anything wrong, but if they have fallouts he always apologises to Tony to sort things out. And Effie says to Sid, you're incapable of doing anything involving effort, focus or subtlety. And Effie bribes him into doing her art coursework and then she'll sort his life shit out. Tony, in a later scene, is saying to his mum while she's still asleep, I'm sorry I messed everything up. I'm sorry I didn't look when crossing the road. I'm sorry you got depressed. Sorry dad can't stand to be at home. It's a very sad and very human moment for Tony, particularly when he was never sorry before. I'd be hopeful that he was going down this path anyway, even if he wasn't hit by a bus, because that conversation he was trying to start with Michelle before he was run over, it is a very human and relatable moment for a lot of disabled people to feel these sorts of things. Effie and Pandora and Tony go to a club, but Tony gets left outside, so they're selling weed and pills. Tony saw Effie give this broken watch that Tony gave to Michelle originally, but she returned to him. Effie is giving it to some guy in a club. Tony sees it and he's just obsessed with like assuming that she sold it, because I think someone gave her money. I think they gave her money probably for the drugs. And it's just like, why? Who would buy a broken watch? Effie also got Tony a new phone because he'd thrown his and broken it. Then a parcel arrives at Michelle's house where her watch is fixed but also engraved, and that fixes a lot of Michelle and Tony problems. Sid then also goes to Cassie's house because Effie set up to get photos of her friend kind of hooking up with Cassie, so she enrages Sid so much with those photos that he goes and does something about it himself. So she fixed the problem. But yeah, the argument between Sid and Cassie is just so weird. Like, I couldn't really follow either point of view, but they both suck. But whatever, pick your poison. Then there's the whole episode of Jal trying to work out how to tell Chris that she's pregnant and she's still ignoring it. Michelle is being very selfish as usual, won't speak anything other than Spanish because she's trying to practice for the Spanish exam. She seems to emotionally want to keep the baby, but intellectually knows she should probably not keep the baby due to, you know, her age and her dreams, particularly with playing the clarinet. A lot of breathing required for clarinet, and if you didn't know, babies basically squash your internal organs, especially lungs. A lot of pregnant women get very breathless, particularly towards the end of pregnancy. We see a quick scene of Chris taking meds, so that's sort of when we first start to actually know that, oh, like maybe he's also sick. But he is also keeping this from Jal. Cassie basically calls Jal out on her secret pregnancy, but also says that Chris has secrets too, so they both need to talk to each other. Jal tries to talk to Michelle again. Michelle is being useless. Jal tells Michelle in Spanish what's going on. Michelle doesn't know the words in Spanish, so has no idea, and then she's distracted by Tony. Bye Jal. And I've made a note here of like, ugh, the people who prioritise romantic and or sexual relationships over their friendships, like, just give me the ick. You know, give me the ick. Bye.
Editing this video has also given me the ability to like reflect on some of the things that I've said already, and I feel like that this whole prioritizing romantic relationships over your friends that Michelle does is very much linked to how her mother treats her and her own romantic relationships. And I don't know whether they did that on purpose, but if they did, that's clever.
Whilst Jal is in her Spanish exam, telling her Spanish teacher everything that's happening, but in Spanish, Chris has been admitted to hospital. Cassie is the main one who sort of keeps an eye on Chris all day as he recovers, because they live together and she doesn't go to college anymore. But everyone does come to visit and participates in the care of him as well, much like they cared for Tony. Jal helps to change Chris's catheter, and Cassie helps change dressings and things like that. Like, they actually do medical care related activities as well, rather than just what they did for Tony. Someone basically dobs Jal in to Chris by saying, oh, Jal's fucked up worse than the rest of us, and he's like, what do you mean? Jal doesn't fuck up. So it scares the living shit out of this poor guy. Cassie meets Chris's mum. She just shows up out of nowhere. That plot literally goes nowhere as well. I think they should have done something more with that. Would have been more interesting. Cassie goes to tell him that his mum was outside, but hears him crying alone in his room. Later he goes to bed because he's feeling weird, and then starts having a fit and bleeding from his like nose and mouth, and wants Jal, but Cassie just freezes. I'm not gonna lie, I don't know if like Cassie just doesn't do anything, doesn't call an ambulance. She just fucks off and goes to New York, and then we have the annoying New York sequence, which is one I also hate. Completely pointless sequence. Does nothing for us. And then the final episode is that Chris died. His dad doesn't want any of his friends at the funeral. Tony and Sid steal Chris's body in the coffin, takes it for a joyride, which I think Chris would appreciate, to be fair. Anwar fails all of his A-levels, just fails all of them. Does really bad. Didn't have a plan for the future, unlike everybody else, but also like, what is Sid doing? Sid also doesn't have a plan. What do you mean? Chris didn't have a plan either, but now he's dead, so. And then like Tony somehow still has amazing grades and is still going to his first choice uni, even though he was literally hit by a bus and couldn't hold a pen until like a month ago. Like, that's what I mean, he miraculously just got completely better in time for his exams. Very confusing. What do you mean? That's just kind of the rest of what happened. But like, I basically feel like there's the two sides of the disability representation, particularly in skins. Generally, like in media that uses disability as a plot point rather than a more realistic depiction of disability. So there's obviously the tragedy porn. Chris being useless, being abandoned, unloved, unsupported, died. Sketch's mum was a burden, made Sketch crazy. Sid, useless, disappointment to his family, just isn't trying hard enough. Dad just fucking dies out of nowhere. Anwar, more interested in social life, sex, drugs, etc. than education and his future. It's shown as a flaw rather than that he may actually need more support for a undiagnosed learning disability. Inspirational disabled people who get over their disabilities, who come out a better person at the other end of things. Tony, just magically cured by weird girl puss. Is a better person as well. He's not an asshole anymore. Like, you know, he was disabled because it was punishment, and he's learned from his sins. Kind of energy. And you know, he just remembers everything now. It's all fine. It was all a joke, actually. Zhao is always incredibly smart, very talented with playing the clarinet, musically talented, music genius, always serious about her work and education, so she deserves it. But then she's her partner still fucking died though. You know, she's still got a tragedy ending, really. It's mostly tragedy porn with a little bit of inspirational disableds going on. Most of the characters generally do not have a good ending, and if they do, it's kind of like a vague ending or like a vaguely okay ending. Like, the only good ending, honestly, of this season is Maxie going to London with his boyfriend and then letting Anwar tag along because they've sorted out their problems. And there were many problems between Maxie and Anwar because that like, wow. Zhao doesn't really have much of a conclusion. It's just that she got good grades and she'll just be going on to do her music course, and had a chat with Chris's dad and they came to an understanding, and it was just sad, you know. And then we have season, like, generation 2. So anyway, hopefully there's something coherent that I can edit out of this. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please leave a like and a comment, subscribe and share. It helps the video, it helps my channel. Let me know what you would like to see next. I can make the Generation 1 queer video. Definitely have some more coherent thoughts on that one. Don't know why I started with this one if I have coherent thoughts on the other one. Question mark, never mind. If there's anything else as well that I may have mentioned at any point that you would like to see me turn into a video, let me know. My head hurts. I've been here for like literally 3 hours. At least 2 hours, but getting to 3. Yeah, that's it from me. I'll see you next week. Bye.